Hey, thanks everybody. We got a ton to get to today. Got a special guest who some of you have who met and seen before. So Brian, thank you for joining us. Thanks for being here again. For those who have not met or heard from before, so Brian is like one of the researchers here, and really has been kind of the architect and the lead kind of writer on the threat detection report for years. So like as we went through launch, called somewhat of an audible. Dave is on a pseudo vacation this week. I understand he's doing manual labor around his around his kids' places, so that's good times. I think that's like granddad spring break. So it's just the two of us here left to our own devices. All right. We're going to start with a couple questions from the mailbag. We had two big themes, things that kind of came in over the course of the last couple weeks. So I'm going to talk through those, one in a little bit less detail and one in more. And then, as promised, I really want to walk through and just kind of give you some of the overview and takeaways from the 2025 threat detection report. And hopefully, what we could spend some time on today is, I guess, the stuff that's not in the report proper, which you can obviously go read on the website or download as a PDF. So without further ado, diving in, I'd say probably one of the two big themes in Q&A this week were these two questions. And I'd say one is kind of red team and both red team and blue team perspective in different ways. And I think does AI actually matter for blue teams is a really interesting, kind of a big question. And so I made a note here. So we're going to talk through these just for a second, but for those of you who can be here next week, so Jimmy, who runs our research and development efforts here, and in particular, all of our AI and machine learning efforts and product integration, is going to be on talking through this in a ton of detail. So I would say really high level, does this matter for blue teams? Absolutely. But I'd say there's a really interesting caveat there. And, Brian, your perspective on this from just, having seen some of the data in terms of how this stuff works and what we've been able to do. I think it absolutely matters. I saw an interesting thread on social yesterday related to Microsoft Security Copilot and some conflicting opinions there in terms of the value utility that people get out of it. My super high level takeaway is it's definitely most things as valuable as you have the data and kind of the pipeline to fuel it. But I'm not sure.
That's exactly my take. The very simple answer is you're going to get what you pay for, so to speak. But having seen the ways just focusing purely on Red Canary, having seen the ways that we've been able to use it and how it's been able to optimize a lot of the identity investigations that we do, it's impossible for me to say no. But also at the same time, I understand that we have a pretty sophisticated team that's got several full-time employees who are tackling this problem every day. So to have a data science function, right, or team to throw at this problem, then yes, it definitely helps you. But if you just have a regular SOC and you've got analysts in there and you just want to shove AI into that workflow, then I think that the answer to that question becomes a lot more complicated if you don't have all the tools and the investments in place to really optimize using that stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely agreed, man. And for those who haven't had an opportunity, I think they just dropped one of Jimmy's blogs in here, but I think he's put out a few things and also a couple videos, and I don't know, his mastery of this subject far exceeds probably both of us put together. So that'll be a super cool session. And I think I don't know if he'll get a ton into the unique threat detection challenges, but I thought I pulled this question primarily because and this came from I believe from a customer CISO who was just asking kind of open-ended, hey, is AI on the adversary side causing you to have to react, build new technology from a detection standpoint? And that one to me was I think it's a simple answer, and it's a no. I do think at least from a technology standpoint, I always like to remind everyone that like adversaries are still subject to the laws of physics, right? Like they can't make computers do new things because of AI. I think it's increasing the pace of experimentation. I know we've definitely um, seen and heard some anecdotes about like just, general quality of things like phishing lures and the ability to stand up lookalike domains and websites faster. But um, so I think there's like, there's some velocity on the adversary side in terms of like iteration and learning, but not so much things that are causing us to have to like really rethink detection primitives, which may be a great segue into um, the uh, the topic we'll get to here in just a moment in the threat detection report. Um, so this one, this is a big one. And again, this is like two of the questions. I think there were three or four total and like all in the same vein. Um, I'm going to take I think we might during the mailbag session, like I think we kind of took and, attempted a 30-second kind of like rapid fire answer to the first one. So like, I'll start with this and just say like, I don't believe that it's true that we're not ceasing operation that we're ceasing operations against Russia or anyone else. I think uh, having spent most of my career in the intelligence community, like this was, I think I understand how that message gets delivered, right? And that like inside of an organization, a memo can come out or a set of priorities can get communicated, and people might gravitate towards or latch on to what's not said, right? Like what's missing or what's not there. My read on the original news related to CISA was just that, right? Um, but I'll say like this one in particular is interesting. Like Russia, China, Iran are huge, like very, very like these are deep, multifaceted national intelligence priorities, not just cybersecurity priorities. And so um, you know, I always encourage folks not to read too much into these, right? You just kind of like zoom out a little bit. There are a bunch of agencies, a bunch of people working on these problems in a wide, wide variety of ways. And like cyber is just one domain or one tool that we use to get these things done. So, um, and then so yeah, I don't know, like Brian, like you're in the DC area, right? So like this is like
Yeah,
your orbit. I feel like you have to
I'm
suffer
a
this conversation every time you leave your house,
I,
probably.
I've lived in the DC area my most of my life. I'm a born and bred swamp creature who thinks and talks about this stuff all the time over the course of, 37 years. So I like my general take from this, I've read a lot about it, and I would encourage everyone to go out and read some of the stuff that Kim Zetter has written about it because she's been covering this stuff forever and she's written a couple Substacks that are pretty interesting. And some of what I'm going to say is like kind of drawn from her ideas. But governments say a lot of things, and there are a lot of different reasons why they say those things. Sometimes it's strictly for public consumption. Sometimes they're trying to signal something to an ally or an enemy. Sometimes they're honest, and like what they say is they're like very honest policy intentions, and sometimes they're dishonest. And in this particular case, like I've read multiple reports about this, and they have all been, not all of them, but many of them have been contradictory, right? And like, so, like, and even the DoD has come out and stepped away from this. So, independent of what they kind of said, like, it also hinges on a really interesting single word, which is planning, right? So, I feel like in the initial reporting, there was questions around whether what they said was stop planning or stop operations. And stopping planning is a whole different thing, but like stopping operations, like you could stop operations for a million reasons. Like if you wanted to go and negotiate with another country, I don't think it's totally unusual to say like throughout the period of time with which we're negotiating, let's say something like a peace deal in Ukraine, maybe let's not do like overt offensive operations against the people that we're communicating with or negotiating with. So like I'm with you, Keith. I didn't read much. I mean, I read a lot about it, but I didn't read much into it. I thought that maybe some things were being misinterpreted in the reporting and some things were being taken out of context. Uh, so yeah, I don't put a lot of weight into like a lot of what's being said about that.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, you kind of mentioned Ukraine, and I think that was kind of the reason I picked these two questions was like they are very closely intertwined, right? Like your point that is like people say and do lots of things for lots of reasons. Um, and I think this second question was interesting, mainly because like it's very like that's much more kind of practitioner defender focused, right? And so like strong geopolitical tie, but this was interesting. Like I plucked this one out because the second I read it, I had this really immediate strong reaction, um, which was like that for 99.9% of us, uh, these events really don't mean much of anything in terms of like threats we can expect to see, right? Specific things we need to do, like um, intelligence priorities that we need to chase on the defender side. Uh, just kind of, and I might have just been the mood I was in that day, but I was just sitting here like taking a step back and I'm like, you know what? Like, for me, like the most likely impact that this is all going to have, and this is not just Ukraine and Russia and China, like this is like broad geopolitics, macroeconomics. Like, you know what I think the most likely consequence of this is? People become conservative in spending, businesses dial back, whether or not we actually like, you know, we or anyone else end up in a recession is kind of immaterial. But even as people start to think about that, like we absolutely know what happens um, when there's just kind of like macroeconomic or geopolitical uncertainty, which is like people are a little bit more conservative and they're hiring and they're planning and they're spending. And I think the most likely place this comes home to roost is that companies just hire a few fewer people on the cybersecurity side. We already see, you know, spending contracting a little bit, right? We see a lot of consolidation, like, and so I think it's like that alone, I think just kind of like that is the much more likely thing day to day that I feel like we're all going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intention of the question, like, the answer is like threat modeling, right? Like, if you make missiles, then you should be worried about these places. And then, like, step back, and ask yourself what you do. And there is a wide spectrum of kinds of businesses that large geopolitical, like large nations would be interested in. But I think most people, it's like just normal security operations, right? That this doesn't much change the way that these countries go about thinking about targeting, I don't think.
No, and I think I'll shamelessly segue this into talking about the threat detection report because I think at the end, well, like one of the things we wanted to talk through was just like a kind of interesting macro look across years of doing our own threat reporting, intelligence analysis, um, and even if these things do flare up, like one particular country, one thing we know is that you're going to see like on the receiving end of this, you're not going to see a lot of novel 0 days and like super clever attacks. What you're probably going to see is just more of a lot of the same things that we've seen over years. And so, if anything, it's just kind of like increasing the urgency for like perimeter vulnerability and exposure management, right? Dialing back that attack surface and then doing day to day detection response and like that security operations blocking and tackling. So, like, um, I'm going to segue into this and kind of talk through the threat detection report. So, I wanted to introduce this for those who aren't familiar, right? This is effectively Red Canary's capstone kind of piece of like public threat research or intelligence research over the course of the year. And so like we're monitoring millions and millions of all of these assets like day in, day out, doing threat detection based on like alerts that we get from different security products, but also a ton of underlying just telemetry and raw activity data. And our team's job is to find the things that slip through the cracks, right? So if for those who are familiar with the venerable Swiss cheese model, right? Like this is the slightly more Red Canary version of that, but like the Swiss cheese model in principle says that like it's an accident or an incident modeling kind of tool, right? Which is to say that upfront a bunch of known threats or known risks get dealt with or prevented, and then the tools that you have and the processes that you have will alert you to some other things that you can go respond to. And really like what the threat detection report for us represents is like our efforts to find things that made it all the way through, right? Meaning they didn't get blocked. And in a lot of cases, like they weren't alerted on, even across like what can be really expensive stacks, right? Of like security products ranging from like identity to cloud to endpoint. And so that is like really where this sits. And I think like kind of why this matters to us and why it's so important. And like hopefully for you all, like the takeaway is that like these are the things that you want to be looking at and looking for because like we've got great data to show year over year over year that these are the things that get missed, right? And um, so Brian, I'll turn it over to you. Oh shoot, lost my screen. Um, so turn it over to you and kind of talk through a little bit more detail when it comes to like, we kind of have these stats on the right, just understanding like we expect to see a published threat per 43 assets. And this was an interesting stat, which is that like, we'll see one high severity threat every year per 160 assets, which seems like a lot. It seems like a low number until you consider that, like Red Canary is a company of a few hundred people, or maybe a few more than that, but like a few hundred people. But we've probably got thousands of assets across like human identity, non-human identity, all of our respective devices, laptops, iPads, phones, like everything we use to work and access our work. So with that, kind of like let you kind of dig in a little bit more. I thought this was a neat chart.
Yeah, so if you kind of flip that 1 in 43 asset on its head, right, and instead of looking at it that way, you look at threats per asset. Um, we've found that the number of threats per asset that we see every year is incredibly consistent. So we have historical threat detection report data, and basically like we looked at 2025s and we got a number. I think it was like 0.02 something, and then we looked at 2024 and we're like, wow, that's weird. It's 0.02 again, right? So they were the same. And then we looked back at previous years, and the previous 3 years before that, it was sitting right around like 0.019 threats per asset. Um, and the interesting thing was like that was also consistent for the 3 years prior. And the thing that changed and caused the number to increase was that we simply added identities, right? So just adding identities kind of ratchets that number up a bit, but largely like that 1 in 43 assets, which is the math done the other way where you flip the denominator, like that's pretty consistent year over year, right? Within, 1 or 2 assets, that's basically what we're always seeing year in, year out. So like we shove more, we get more and more and more assets that we're monitoring. And unless we add a whole new domain, in this case, identity is the one that seems to have made the change. Like that ratio of threats per asset remains really consistent over time.
That
So
was like fascinating because I think one of the I don't know, you kind of always assume like on the product side, I do think like detection gets better. I do think overall like we're learning more about like attack surface reduction. And so I feel like until you kind of showed us this data, like I always had it in my head that like the rate of incidents in general, like when you kind of normalize per asset, like should be going down. And so I don't know, it is, and I know it's like a little bit of a moving target, right? The flip side of that is like, the more you look for things and the harder you look for them, like you will find them, right? But it'll be really interesting to look at this, I think, in the out years to see like this to me is like one of those numbers that uh, like when you look at it over a long period of time is going to tell an interesting story about like control efficacy and how good a job we're really doing, like not necessarily detecting and responding, but like taking opportunity away in mass, right?
yeah,
So yeah, this was also like a little bit of a zoomed in look. So I
yeah,
think
and
this,
this is just looking at identity, right? So like we Red Canary obviously was an endpoint, mostly endpoint security company for a very long time. And then as we added identity and started looking, we started to find threats there a lot more. And as you can see from this, like we are seeing a significant uptrend in the amount of identity related threats that we are seeing, not quite month over month, but if you cluster these together quarterly, it is like straight up and to the right. Um, and like, it's not only because adversaries are targeting identities more. I think some of that's happening. I also think that like we're just getting a lot better at sifting through what can be extremely voluminous piles of identity telemetry and identity alerts using teaser to next week. A lot of AI functionality that's been built out by Jimmy's team, who's going to be on next week. Shameless plug. Uh, and like we've just been much better at finding like the needles in the haystack that is like identity threats amidst this like giant pile of alerts in telemetry.
yeah. And I don't know, curious what folks who are joining us today, like, what your kind of experience is. I think in terms of like the conversations that I know, like at least I've personally been having, and I think I can speak for others at Red Canary, that seems to be, um, just the amount of opportunity from an investigative standpoint that exists in the identity space in particular is one where, when you kind of talk about blue team applications for AI, like, I mean, it felt like a somewhat controversial take a year ago, I think, when it like first occurred to me, but like, I'm not sure there's any other way to keep pace with that when you just think about the sheer amount of like signal that comes from all of the underlying like identity and IDP platforms. I mean, it's, thousands of those investigations every day that we're running. Um, and there's no amount of hiring or people you can throw at that type of problems. Like to your point, like a really good tee up for Jimmy is just like, where do you even kind of start to approach that? And what does efficacy look like? So,
Yeah, you can click through so one thing to point out here is like identities are an extremely high priority target for adversaries for like the maybe obvious reason that is if you can get into an identity, you can then use that identity to go access other things. Like the more privileged the identity, the better. But even if you look at this list here, like Luma C2 is a fantastic example. This is a stealer. It can steal a lot of things. It's number 6 on here. Um, but one of the primary things it steals is stuff like credentials, like session tokens, API keys, things like that, that can then be used to go and log into identities, right? So you have this really commoditized ecosystem of stealers. Like Luma C2, you get a license to that thing for $250. You can buy the source code to it for $20,000. Anybody can go and buy this thing and use it, and there's instructions, and it's like a great example of this malware as a service ecosystem. And like these stealers are sort of driving to some degree a lot of these identity compromises. And yeah, again, like this is our top 10 threats. There's a bunch of downloaders on here that will deliver other downloaders. They sometimes will deliver things like Cobalt Strike. They can lead to ransomware. A lot of them end up delivering things like Luma C2 and other stealers. Net Support Manager cracked our list of the top 10 this year. We're seeing a lot of adversaries who are just straight up social engineering people into downloading Net Support Manager and other remote monitoring and management tools through a variety of means. Like we've seen this Black Basta ransomware group doing this email bombing, and then they'll send you an inbound Teams message and they'll say, hey, like, we know you're having issues with your email. Download this thing and we'll fix it. And that thing is Net Support Manager. And then they've got, control of your computer. And then the other big thing, which you've talked about a few times here, has been this paste and run fake CAPTCHA scheme where like they're just tricking people into literally copying and pasting a malicious PowerShell or MSHTA script into the run dialog box on Windows to just execute code. Sometimes that leads to Net Support Manager, sometimes Luma C2. A whole bunch of groups have picked it up this year.
yeah, there's actually a question that came in, and I'm not sure. I don't know if you know the specific answer to this. I am familiar with like one aspect of it. So Raul was asking, if these things are swiping credentials found in password managers and stuff like that. And I'm not sure, like there's a little bit of intricacy in kind of like what constitutes like getting access to those. But like the one thing I do know is like what their primary means of capture is like capturing as those credentials are used, right? And so, um,
Or from cookies
yeah,
in the browser. So I don't know if they access, I'd have to look into like technically how like those password managers actually work. I don't remember us mentioning that as one of the things they target, but they definitely like a lot of the Mac OS stealers will steal from keychain, right? So on Mac OS, like there's definitely a functionality for that to happen. Maybe not directly from a password manager, but definitely from like your keychain storage on the Mac OS device.
got it. Yeah, I have to, I said the specifics of like, can it access the actual vault, which I assume would be useless unless it was unlocked. But even just the runtime capture alone, right? Just being able to get access to like cookies, session tokens, which you mentioned is a really big one. Like that is an end run around, unless you're enforcing a combination of like identity and device trust, can be a little bit thorny. So like
In,
that's a huge problem.
a great point in the comments here from someone who's operating under the pseudonym Dash. Uh, Like, yes, they can definitely steal from clipboards too. So like the act of copying something out of a password manager and into whatever you're going to use it on is a way to get access to those things.
Yep. Yeah. And there's a ton of research. I feel like these are changing, but maybe like the last thing I'll say there is like just and was having this conversation I think as recently as this morning just about the in general browsers being like really needing to be treated like a device unto themselves. And I think the amount of kind of like surveillance and monitoring and data collection we're going to have to do like within the browser because of these problems, which are just like increasingly like intricate, they're fast moving. Um, answering questions like, can it steal from this or that? Or like, they're like, and a lot of times a gray area and it kind of like, it comes down to the how and the implementation and a bunch of other things. So like,
Yeah, browser-based like threats and delivery of threats has been a big trend for a couple of years, and it has definitely not gone away. So moving on to techniques here, these are our top MITRE attack techniques that we observed this year. And just a few things to point out here. Like Keith's going to show this in even more stark detail in the upcoming slides, but like a lot of these are fairly stagnant year over year. The real risers on here over the last couple of years and in this year in particular are things like cloud accounts, email forwarding rule, and email hiding rules is actually the only technique in this top 10 that's never been in the top 10 before. But basically, what's happening is adversaries are hijacking these identities and then using them to move into SaaS apps like email. The other interesting one to call out here, like I just mentioned, how that paste and run technique was leveraging PowerShell and MSHTA scripts. MSHTA is back in our top 10 for the first time in a number of years. So like we got a really, really interesting rewrite of that one that we did this year. It's definitely worth checking out.
yeah. So, you mentioned that and everyone can go read, there's a ton of information online. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on these, but like you just kind of called out, like in just that kind of macro trend of like these things like PowerShell, WMI, stuff like that. Um, and even things like HGA, which maybe like haven't cracked the top 10 in like the big reporting, but like these things are like the baseline level of usage for these things is high. And I think that, this was kind of just looking across like years of the threat detection report. Um, like command and scripting interpreter hand like nothing even comes close, right? And like originally PowerShell was its own technique in MITRE attack, and so like we kind of like looked at it differently. Um, so these have since kind of been like blown up and expanded back out into sub techniques, but like these things and this is like I feel like living off the land has kind of become like it's a little bit of a trite expression now, but um, it is still absolutely bonkers the prevalence of these things and how often they continue to
Uh,
occur.
on Mac OS too, right? We see a ton of Apple
Yep.
script and JavaScript on Mac OS, so it's not just a Windows problem.
Yep. Um, process injection was an interesting one. So like, I don't know, like, Brian, what's your take on this? Cause this was this kind of like stat or trend jumped out at me. But like, I know, I mean, it's been, again, the baseline level of utilization for this is still relatively high. Like the problem is not gone, but it's just interesting to look at how it's moved over the years.
I mean, I think you nailed it when we were talking earlier. Like I think it's probably just gotten harder to do. Or alternatively, like there are just better options available to adversaries now than process injection.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It feels like it's noisy, right? So like, and by way of, and incidentally, I should mention, like, you mentioned the click fix and paste and run thing, which we talked about a little bit last week. So just tricking people into running PowerShell. But I did find, it was actually just swapping emails with someone this morning. I noticed like, so Brian Krebs did a kind of like a big roundup on ClickFix, which is like, for those of you who weren't here last week, tricking people into hitting Command R or Windows R on a Windows machine and then just literally pasting in a PowerShell command to kind of bootstrap an infection. And one thing I noticed, like, was buried all the way at the bottom of the Brian Krebs article was just a GPO to disable that, like that shortcut to open the command prompt, um, which is wild. Actually, I had somebody just reach out, was like, "Hey, I don't know if you saw the Krebs thing, like they were here last week," and he just followed up. And And so like that was just an interesting kind of like exchange. And I was like, I've since run into a couple people who have decided to do that, which is like on the one hand feels draconian, but on the other hand, like again, baseline level of utilization and abuse of stuff like PowerShell in particular, but also all these other scripting harnesses is like super, super high. Um, it's like last thing here, and we'll kind of like illustrate this a little bit more in this final chart. But this was wild. 24 unique techniques in the top 10 over 7 years. And like this kind of like I stole a picture from, I think, Brian, probably one of your presentations, which was just illustrating like across all these threats that we see, it's actually like a really small, unique set of underlying techniques that they use. And you can replace those threat names with like sock Golish, like Cobalt Strike, all of these tools like open source, closed source, malware as a service, kind of doesn't matter, right? But like, I don't know. So like that was, I stole that from you. So I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add there before we kind of pop into the leaderboard, but
The threats change. The things that they do don't change. Sorry, we know we're at time.
yep.
We're almost done. Thanks to everyone who can stick around.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, this is a fun thing to kind of leave you all with. And this was just like this is the top 10 across all 7 years if you kind of add them all up. So I think we're into our typical overtime here this week, but we'll send this stuff out. And like, I don't know, it's been fun to look at and a lot of fun to do. So like, thank you, Brian, so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And appreciate your team and sorry, your work and the whole team's work on the threat detection report. So.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ooh, got a good one there. Gonna make a note of that. Brian, we got a request for favorite books off your bookshelf.
I'm not sure. There might only be one. I'll have to think about that. I don't know if there's actually any cybersecurity books back there.
Those
Maybe
are all coloring books, actually.
Yeah, they're actually fake. They're just, it's a facade. I think maybe Sandworm is back there. That might be the only one, though.
Love
And
it.
that Sandworm's great, though. Everyone go read Sandworm.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate you all being here as always. Keep the questions coming. We're going to keep taking them up front. That's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Y'all have a great day.